Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on our second day of the symposium. I am so thrilled to introduce briefly to you all a woman that needs no introduction. I'm sure all of you know Krista, but we have with us for this wonderful, super helpful plenary session, Krista Del Gallo, the interim or the legislative director for the Texas Council on Family Violence. She's provided numerous trainings to folks in our community. We are all better for it, and we really look forward to hearing from Krista about the various legislative changes that are impacting how we practice law around family violence and various other laws that address and touch upon family violence here in the state of Texas. I'd like to say that we are seeing improvements in the laws in many areas, and I look forward to Krista sharing those with us. She will tell you a little bit more about herself. But I will allow Krista to take it over now. Thank you once again, Krista, for joining us. And everyone, reminder, give us some questions in the chat for Krista as we're going through the presentation. We'll be happy to facilitate her answering those. Thank you. Krista, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Judge Diaz. Good morning and happy Friday to everyone. Thank you for the invitation to present on the legislative session, the 88th regular legislative session that we had that concluded on Memorial Day. I have to remind folks that I'm going to be talking about the 88th regular legislative session as opposed to the legislative session that's a special called session that will begin on Monday and is more centered around school choice and the border. And so I don't have any information yet to share on that, but I will talk about what happened in the regular session. Again, my name is Krista Del Gallo. I work at the Texas Council on Family Violence. And Darren, you can advance to the next slide. It just shows a long road that we really take before, in advance of a legislative session at the Texas Council in terms of developing our priorities. And so one of the key parts of developing those priorities is being informed by the field. And that's folks like you, it's advocates at our family violence centers, it's folks that work for the courts, attorneys that are supporting survivors, prosecutors, etc. And so we really try to gather all of the feedback and information that we get in the interim. So that's right now to hear how laws are working for survivors and what continues to be challenges for survivors. One of the pieces of information that I've been sharing since before the 88th session to try to get us to a felt list of priorities is that there are only certain things that can be accomplished through the Texas legislature. And for certain things, like changing the law or adding new laws to our code books, the Texas legislature is the only path to accomplishing those goals. So we're not going to be able to accomplish the lofty goal of preventing family violence in the state of Texas through a legislative session. But we can make incremental change in our laws that can help support survivors and their families and all of the folks and stakeholders that work with survivors on supporting their safety and holding people who use violence accountable. We can make changes to those laws so that we are creating a safer landscape in Texas. And if you'll go to the next slide, Darren, it's important also to note that the Texas legislature, though it's the only means to create new laws, it is not an easy place for a bill. We had over 10,000 bills filed in the 88th regular session, and the passage rate was about 10% of those actually passed and were enacted into law. And so that's important to note as well, that the process is not necessarily set up to pass your proposal. It's really set up to pause and block your proposal. So there's a lot that needs to be considered in what you're trying to get through the Texas legislature, and a lot of advocacy that needs to take place during session to ensure that you're shepherding your idea or bill along. It's also interesting that following the regular session, Governor Abbott made a very large amount of vetoes. And so he vetoed 76 bills. So that means 76 of those 10% of bills that did make their way all the way through both chambers and passed out of the Texas legislature in the time were then vetoed, and so are not laws. And so that's another way in which your bill can die, even if it made its way all the way through. So just a little bit of information, and we only have a legislative session every other year. We're a biennial legislature. What we're going into on Monday is a special called session. Those have to be called by the governor of the state, and they are specific to certain items that the governor puts on the call. So if the governor has only put on the call school choice and border related issues, we can't go in and say, hey, how about I file a bill on protective orders? Because that's outside of the realm of the call. Also, special called sessions are only 30 days, which is even faster than the 5 months about that we have for a regular session every other year. So they're not really intended for a lot of public input. They're more for doing the business that our state executive and the legislature sort of want to accomplish almost without a lot of that public input because it's so quick. And if we can go ahead and advance, and speaking of sort of the blocks that come up as we go through every legislative session, I'm going to start with talking about some of the priorities that didn't make it. And I think it's important because these were very important priorities to us, the Texas Council on Family Violence, to advocates and survivors and our stakeholders that we worked really hard on. And for a variety of different reasons, we were unsuccessful in being able to pull them all the way through. But that doesn't mean that as issues, we're not going to continue to work on them. And we really, really invite your support as we try to think about ways to enhance access to some of these remedies that we were working on pulling through in the legislative session. So the first bill that I'll highlight that was unsuccessful was specific to firearms. And so we can go to the next slide. And we had a priority around firearms that Representative Moody out of El Paso filed, and it was specific only to when courts are issuing an order that prompts a state firearm prohibition. So when courts are convicting someone of a Class A misdemeanor involving domestic violence, a felony, or when they're issuing a protective order for family violence, all those, not only under federal law, but also under Texas state law, kick in firearm prohibitions for a temporary amount of time for those defendants and respondents. This bill would have required that courts, upon handing down that order, would then require the defendant or respondent to provide an affidavit to the court stating either whether or not they have firearms. So if they don't possess any firearms, they could just assert, I don't have any firearms to dispose of. Or it would prompt them to say, these are the firearms I have, and this is where I've disposed of those firearms, or can you help me and support me in finding a place to transfer these firearms temporarily. And so it really was getting a paper trail and prompting some next steps around firearm transfers. And that's so incredibly important because though we have laws on the books that say someone is too dangerous to possess a firearm for a certain period of time, and we know based on our new numbers through Honoring Texas Victims that firearms continue to be the leading means used in domestic violence related homicides in Texas and across the country. But we're not as a community, as communities across the state, taking consistent next steps to ensure that those folks that have been deemed too dangerous to possess actually don't continue to possess firearms and pose a threat to both victims, families, and their communities. So we do encourage you all to continue to have conversations about what is happening once there is a firearm prohibition and how we can hold those offenders and protective order respondents accountable and keep victims safe. Moving on to the next priority that we were unsuccessful with, it was around codifying the opportunity for a protective order applicant to request to appear virtually. We know that during the pandemic, when many courts had gone virtual and continued to hold protective order hearings, that being able to appear remotely was a game changer for many victims, because maybe they never considered applying for a protective order because the thought of standing in front of a judge right next to their abuser and detailing all the violence seemed just not safe to them and not doable. And so this really opened access for protective orders for many survivors. And we really wanted to continue it as an option for those survivors that sought it across the state, because what we have now is really an inequitable framework of access for protective orders, because there's some jurisdictions that will still honor a request by a survivor to appear remotely and allow for that if they're saying that that's what they really need. And then there's others where that is absolutely not an option. So whatever that y'all are doing in your protective order courts to continue to advance this as an option, not as a default, but as something that if a survivor articulates, it would be much easier for me to appear remotely in this process, that if you're continuing to allow for that, and we'll be continuing to work on enhancing access to this type of option. And the last thing that I'll just mention was around coerced debt. I'll bring this up more as an information point on what is coerced debt, which in the state of Texas, we have codified that victims of domestic violence that are also victims of coerced debt, that means their abuser who already knew their information and took out a line of credit with that information that they did provide to their abuser, right? Most abusers know your, if you're married, they know your social security number and your mother's maiden name, etc. And so, but a lot of times when survivors went and said, I want to file a report of identity theft to the police department, that, they were met with, well, your husband can't steal your identity. You already, you've shared that information with them. But in fact, many victims of domestic violence have had their identity fraudulently taken and then lines of credit taken out. And also they've been forced to take out lines of credit and coerced by their abusers. So all of that is now included in the definition of identity theft in Texas. And so it's important just for law enforcement to note that, and also for advocates and people working with survivors, that there is relief available. Unfortunately, we were not successful in getting relief from the debt collectors on debt that is known to have been accrued through identity theft. That was what HB 4641 would have done. It would have prohibited debt collection efforts once a debt was known to be collected through identity theft. But we can continue to work to support survivors of coerced debt. And then moving on to TCFV's priorities, the reason why we go into a legislative session with a very small number of key agenda items is because every year funding is our main priority, and funding for family violence center programs. We can go to the next slide, and that is precisely because, one, it's not a guarantee. Funding for family violence programs and services is something that requires advocacy at the legislature and requires the Texas legislature to appropriate those funds every session. So it doesn't just happen as an automatic. And so we do need to go in there. And we know that even though in Texas we enjoy a generous legislature in terms of funding for core emergency services for family violence survivors, it's still not meeting the demand. And so we have programs that have to deny survivors seeking shelter because they simply don't have capacity or space to offer that shelter bed or room, or to offer that service that a survivor who's taking that brave step to call and reach out for help is saying they need. And as you all can imagine, that can really deflate someone as they're help seeking, and really change what kind of decisions that they make moving forward. And so we want to have a Texas where every time a survivor is reaching out for support, that request for support is actually met with services. And so we were successful in this last legislative session. You can go to the next slide, in getting $88 million in the ADA session for the 24-25 biennium. And that $88 million over these 2 years is for both level funding for core emergency services that our centers provide, as well as for what are called exceptional item services. And so that's supplemental funding that will assist family violence programs with going over and above for survivors in the areas of economic stability, housing, legal services, and in mental health care. And so things that aren't part of the core emergency services package, but that are extremely important for survivors in terms of being able to get safe and stable. The other piece that we were able to get into that funding of the $88 million is $3 million specifically for prevention and community education efforts. So while this is a very modest amount of money that will be allocated to our family violence centers to do prevention work, it is the first time we have ever gotten funding specifically for prevention work. So we're very excited about that. We also were able to see an increase for our batterer intervention and prevention program at $5 million over the biennium. And we secured level funding for our domestic violence high-risk teams. If you're curious about what DVHRTs are, TCFE has a section on our website that discusses these more. We have a domestic violence high-risk team coordinator. We are in the process of determining funding for our new sites in this year. And we also have a domestic violence high-risk teams report that was just released that really shares the data and the themes that came from our funded sites over the last year. The last funding priority that we did work with the legislature on was around Victims of Crime Act funds. While these flow from the federal government, we have gone to the legislature both in a special called session of the 87th session and this time to get some relief in terms of the declines that folks are seeing in counties and communities around VOCA funds. We also, TCFE has had several meetings, as had the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault and our partners at the Children's Advocacy Centers, with our members of Congress, because it's really up to Congress to make the changes that will fix VOCA so it is solvent and that we don't continue to have to do these patchwork band-aids at the state level. So moving into our policy priorities, the first policy priority I'll talk about is around family violence services standards. We were successful in passing this bill. It's the first update to family violence center standards under our Human Resources Code in over 20 years. So now those service standards actually reflect what is really happening in our family violence programs across the state. And notably, it did include prevention work for the first time in code. So we both codified that work that family violence centers do in the Human Resources Code, and we were able to secure modest amount of funding for that prevention work. The next priority that we went into the session with was around stalking. And so we had heard both from survivors of intimate partner violence and stalking that oftentimes when they reached out to law enforcement and discussed their concerns around stalking behaviors, they were met with a response that nothing could be done. We heard from prosecutors that the stalking statute as it was crafted was extremely difficult to utilize and apply successfully in these cases. And so we worked with a whole host of different folks to update the stalking statute in the penal code. So it's less confusing, a little more organized, and it also includes that not only could the survivor feel all of the types of adjectives, or maybe they're adverbs in the harassment statute, right? Harassed, annoyed, threatened, etc. We also added the terms terrified or intimidated, because so often that's exactly what victims of stalking report that they feel, is that they felt scared about what happened. They felt like that the action was taken expressly to intimidate them, and to change their behavior. And so we were able to add those words. We also updated the reasonable person standard to make sure that it was a reasonable person, you're considering the reasonable person in the victim's position. And so if it's a victim of stalking and intimate partner violence, and that same person is the stalker and the abuser, there's some interesting context pieces. So a reasonable person might not assume that flowers on your front step at the first of the month or on your birthday is something that you would be scared about. But if you knew that the last time you had flowers on your doorstep, it was followed by a very violent episode, or by that was the way your abuser said, I know where you are, then it's a very different context. So we did make sure that that reasonable person standard that's part of the triumvirate for our stalking statute did have to consider what the victim's circumstances was. So we're excited to continue to hear from prosecutors, law enforcement, and survivors how this new statute is working. And so moving into some other notable bills that did pass. So as I mentioned, we work on just a very small number of express priorities and our funding, but we know that there's going to be so many bills introduced that we really want to get behind and support. They might be bills of our allies, and there's also bills that we are going to have to work because we have concerns about. We did really well this session. There was a whole constellation of bills that were passed specific to domestic violence that I am hopeful are going to be extraordinarily helpful to survivors. The first was around judicial training. And while judges already have what's called a 12-hour family violence education requirement, within the code, that training needs to be around family violence or sexual assault or human trafficking or child abuse. And both human trafficking and child abuse have minimums number of hours within that 12 hours. So there were cases where you had judges that are hearing family violence cases, and while they might have met their 12 hours of family violence education credits, they might have never actually taken a training specifically on family violence dynamics, because there's a whole host of other issue areas that they could get that, meet those hours with. And so this requires that every judge upon election does have a minimum of 1 hour of training on family violence dynamics specifically, and that judges that hear family law or family violence related cases also have a continuing education requirement. Notably, it brings the Texas Council on Family Violence into the development of that training. So we look forward to working with the Center for the Judiciary on standardizing some training for that 1 hour and continuing education component. And then moving on to the next one, we also were successful in working on a bill around court interpretation for folks who are indigent and cannot afford their interpreter. This will also require courts to report to OCA, the Office of Court Administration, about the number of people that are filing statements of inability to pay and having their court interpretation services provided. So hopefully this will be another step forward in language access in our courts. And then moving on, had several bills around protective orders. Senate Bill 48 that requires the use of standardized forms in protective orders was a bill that also came around in the 87th session in 2021. It passed through both chambers. It was actually vetoed by the governor in the summer. following the 87th session. So Senate Bill 48 was another swing at this attempt that addressed some of the governor's stated concerns in his veto announcement of the former bill. One of the things that this will do is it's OCA, the Office of Court Administration, that will be the group that is responsible for the creation of these forms, but that is in concert and in working with a whole host of other stakeholders. So TCFE is involved, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid will be involved, the Texas District and County Attorneys Association, individual prosecutors, and there's a lot of other folks written into the bill that must be consulted with in the development of these forms. So we look forward to these, and hopefully they'll promote greater enforcement of protective orders in our state. And then moving on to probably one of the most significant changes to the protective order statutes in terms of the family code in many, many years is House Bill 1432, which removes the second required finding for a court to issue a family violence protective order. So prior to September 1st of this year, a court, in order to issue a protective order, must find that family violence had occurred. That's the first finding. And second, that family violence was likely to occur in the future. HB 1432 removed that second required finding. So now the only required finding for issuance of a family violence protective order is the finding that family violence occurred. This is significant. We know that there is some concern that this might mean that people that are like that potentially abusers could apply and receive protective orders against victims. We know that already happens sometimes, but we will be cautious and working with communities to make sure that the removal of that second finding doesn't result in that sort of practice, but it does result in creating greater access to protective orders, because we had heard across the state that judges were just using their own determination of whether or not they thought that it was likely to occur in the future. So for instance, if the respondent had moved out of town, sometimes they said they didn't think it was going to happen. They said, I know it happened, but you guys are getting divorced, so I don't think it's going to happen again. And so we are hoping that this is more centering the survivor applicant for protective orders, and that they're applying for this order that they really do need because they do fear future violence and they need it to become safe. And then moving on, we also had a privacy bill related to protective orders. Already, protective order applicants can request that their physical address be excluded from the order itself and be held confidential. And this bill now also allows them to request that the county is also held confidential. And moving on, I'm going to start to go rather quickly through some of these just for the sake of time, but happy to talk through any of these at a later date or receive emails on any of these. The two other privacy measures I'll mention are around occupational licenses. Oftentimes those require that your residential address is publicly available. And so we had two bills that address that safety concern for survivors that also hold those certain types of occupational licenses. Moving on, we also, if we could go to the next slide, please. Great. We also had a bill that allows courts to include additional prohibitions in protective orders, in magistrates' orders of emergency protection, conditions of bond, and also in temporary divorce orders. And they can include prohibitions against tracking or monitoring someone's property or vehicles, or using another individual to track that person. It also creates a criminal consequence for these types of behaviors. So that is another tool or prohibition that can be integrated into both civil orders as well as into those protective orders and conditions of bond. And then moving on, We had a great enhancement to our crime victims compensation program. And so now access to rent and relocation, which is often the most important for survivors of family violence in terms of what CVC can offer, was limited because the definitions that were utilized for CVC eligibility, the definitions utilized for household family violence and family members were narrower than the general broader definitions. So now we're using broader definitions to open up more access to rent and relocation. And there's been a historic increase to the total amount of rent and relocation available. It went up from $1,800 to $5,000. So we're really hopeful that this will support survivors in relocating and gaining safety and stability faster. Moving on. And this is another pretty significant piece of legislation that passed around what most folks are familiar with, the notice to adult victims. Some law enforcement call it the blue card. And so SB 1325 required that the Health and Human Services Commission actually start to work to create an update to that information that is required to be given to certain victims. It also expanded the types of victims to whom law enforcement must provide this. So it's to victims of family violence, to victims of terroristic threats, to victims of sexual assault and stalking. And so SB 1325 requires this is updated to also include more information on lease termination. And we've been working with the Health and Human Services Commission over the last several months on this notice. And I'm happy to say that it will not only be a written notice that law enforcement, campus law enforcement, and the medical professionals will be required to provide to these victims, but the notice will also have a code on it that someone can take a picture of, and it'll take them directly to a website with much more information. Because we know, one, we can't flood a victim that's just called the police for something with too much information, but we want to make sure that they know where to find that information when they're ready to process that. So we're excited both about the updated notice and the website that will be accompanying that. And then moving on, just to note that there were several expansions in healthcare. HB 12 expanded postpartum Medicaid to 12 months after the end of a pregnancy. And so that will be hopefully very helpful to all of our folks that are giving birth and will continue to have healthcare coverage. As many of you probably have heard, Texas has the worst uninsured rate in the country, and particularly postpartum. That's a time period when we're thinking about survivors and their children that we really need people to continue to have access to preventative health care and to have those touch points with the healthcare system so that the healthcare system can join us in preventing and intervening in family violence if that's coming up. There was also expansions and funding for the family planning program and Healthy Texas Women's programs. And so we really want to make sure that as you're working with people in communities, that you are connecting them to these types of services and coverage because they can be so incredibly important. Not on this slide, but of note, there was also a bill that eliminated sales tax for family care items. These include insulin, syringes, diapers, feminine hygiene products, a whole host of different types of things, maternity clothes, etc. And so hopefully that will be helping families as when they're in different stages of life and caring for other family members. And lastly, just to bring up, because this is a collaborative council, there was a bill that requires healthcare facilities to have workplace violence provisions. I'll go ahead and just leave out the criminal laws so we can advance to the the next visual slide. Great, thank you. This is the cover of our 88th legislative report. It's available on our website at tcfe.org, public policy. So we encourage y'all to go and take a look at it. It includes most of the bills that I have mentioned. And if we can go on again. And one more, yes, and we would really appreciate everyone's engagement in legislative advocacy. You can do this in a variety of ways. One, please consider becoming a member of the Texas Council on Family Violence. You can be an individual member. Most of our family violence centers across the state are Category 1 organizational members. We have free lifetime individual membership for survivors, but it really does bring you into the fold of our work. And those membership dues that folks pay support our ability to be able to engage in lobbying, because we cannot do so with our governmental grants. During the legislative session, we also have a listserv called Capital Crew that we'll send out alerts on. So you're welcome to join that through the public policy section of our webpage. And we also just encourage you all to continue to know and grow your relationships with your legislators. That makes all of the difference. We really are seen as an Austin-based special interest group at the Texas legislature, even though we are a statewide entity and very connected to the field. So we really rely on the fact that programs and stakeholders in every community and every district are engaging with their legislators. So when we're entering an office and talking with a legislative staff person, this is not the first time they've ever heard about issues and challenges for family violence survivors or for their communities around serving survivors in their state. That makes it incredibly difficult to really win over an elected official. But when they've already heard about this, when they know that when I say, your local program, Family Violence Prevention Services, and they are very familiar with that program, it really opens the door so much wider. And I know that many of you all do that in the San Antonio area, because the Bexar County delegation tends to be very responsive and receptive to issues around family violence. Please don't stop. I'm in Laredo right now, and Senator Zaffarini out of Laredo is one of our greatest champions in the Senate. And we want that to just continue so we can build a legislature that's very informed on these issues. And in the last 2 minutes that I have, I would love to see if there's any questions that I can answer or respond to. And definitely you all have my contact information there, and on my co-director, Molly Foyles. And then we also have an easy email for our policy team. It's just policy@tcfe.org. If you ever have a quick question, can't find my email, and you want to send it to policy@tcfe.org, please feel free. And I'll pause there for any last minute questions, if any came in. Thank you, Linda. And I don't know, did anyone that's monitoring the questions see anything that came in? Thank you so much, Judge Diaz. I'm not seeing any in the, let me see a private chat. Okay, let's see. All right, well, really appreciate it, and the ability, let me see. Okay, regarding the changes to CVC, is there any help for victims of DV who don't live with their abuser for relocation assistance? There could be. So I need to go back to the bill and the way in which it expanded family or household member, but that could be possible if you don't reside with if you don't reside with the abuser, but still you're a victim of family violence and need to relocate because the abuser does know where you live. So those definitions of who is eligible have been expanded. And as you all probably know as well, for lease termination, which some folks might have to do to legally release themselves from liability from their lease if they do need to relocate, that is available to folks that do not cohabitate with their abusive partner. It just also requires a 30-day notice.
Thank you so much, Krista. Was I right, folks? She never disappoints. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It was extremely helpful. I learned some new things, actually, that I was not aware of. So I really appreciate that. I look forward to taking that back to our colleagues here in Bexar County. So thank you very much, Krista. And thank you to everyone who's joining us. We're almost nearing the end of our symposium. We have one more really powerful presentation for you all. I hope you'll stick around for it. We have a quick recess. We will reconvene at 10:30 a.m. to hear from San Antonio's First Lady, Erica Prosper Nuremberg. Thanks, folks.